Well, I want to now talk with the three Woody Allen experts about the last 24, almost a quarter of a century, his post, what I would call post Golden Age work. And to get into it, I want to talk about the idea of memory. Earlier on, we had talked about the ending of Radio Days, and I think it's one of endings in Woody Allen's films, talking about memory and how farther away. And I actually quoted it in a poem of mine. But in regards to memory, it seems to me that a lot of these later films are sort of carbon copies or paler recapitulations of earlier films to a lesser degree. But this is something that I think goes and veins itself throughout Woody Allen's own work. Just I was writing down a handful of films, both from other filmmakers and himself, that Woody has sort of touched upon. You go from Midsummer Night's sex comedy. 5 or 6 years later, you get September, both Chekhovian type mini dramas. You got Crimes and Misdemeanors. You take away the comic part, you get Cassandra's Dream and Match Point. Annie Hall, Manhattan to a certain degree, just a couple of years later, is sort of a reworking of that. Hannah and Her Sisters, I think, owes quite a bit of debt, especially with the adultery and the philandering and the sibling internecine squabbling, to Rocco and his brothers from Lucchino Visconti. 8 and a Half, obviously, influenced Stardust Memories. Amarcord, another Fellini. You get Radio Days. Actually, you can go to Bergman's, what is his, after Wild Strawberry, I think, influenced certainly Another Woman, which then influenced Money and Run, the mockumentaries. You get Zelig, and then even Husbands and Wives is in a sense a mockumentary as well. So before we talk about any of the particular films, let me just, since we ended talking about the scandal, sort of summing up the Golden Age, let's talk about Woody Allen and memory and how that approaches his film. Do any of you fellas want to jump in and talk about Allen and memory?
Yeah.
I'd like to start.
Go ahead, Peter.
If I could. The scenes that occur to me are the Stardust Memories scene in Stardust Memories, where we're looking at Dory, and it's this perfect moment, and we're listening to Louis Armstrong playing Stardust. That seems to be one of the most ecstatic moments in his films. And so it's interesting that you want to talk about memories, because then we go to Radio Days, where Wally Shawn is on the roof talking about will they ever remember us? And then the narrator comes in and says that those voices grow more and more dim every year. And then there's a scene in Husbands and Wives in which obviously the Allen character is trying to keep the marriage together by talking about a wonderful night. I think they actually went to see Wild Strawberries, and then they walked back through the snow. And the Mia Farrow's character's response is, "But those are just moments. Those are just moments. They're not. They don't mean anything but moments." And therefore you can't keep a marriage together based on memories. And the next thing we see, the marriage has been lanced, and she's going after Liam Neeson, and he's on his own. Yeah, his attitude towards memory, I think, is quite complicated and interesting. Partly cynicism, partly a kind of realistic assessment of the way in which at times memory seems redemptive, and at other times not so redemptive at all.
Vincent, any comments about Woody Allen and memory and how it infuses his work?
I'd like to take a somewhat, I agree with what Peter was saying there, and I could maybe quote from a great ending to Crimes and Misdemeanors: "Take joy in moments." This is now quoting that Primo Levi-based character, the philosopher, the suicide, the Holocaust survivor. "Take joy in moments and believe in love, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary." Great line. And that sums up a lot of Woody Allen's worldview and his films. Yes, that wonderful, joyous moment. By the way, in Stardust Memories, as I was watching it, and I said I found it insufferable, but that moment almost redeemed the entire.
Yes, right.
Such a great moment. Okay, memories. Another element of memory in Allen's work is the memory of his own work. He's in dialogue continually with his own work, not only with other filmmakers' work, such as Fellini and Bergman primarily, but Antonioni and, as you said, Visconti and others. He's always in dialogue with his own work. So, and that comes to the fore sometimes more than others. Deconstructing Harry is Stardust Memories 2, if you will, and anything else is Annie Hall 2, and it's a sequel to Annie Hall. I don't know if we're going to get to anything else, but I think that's one of his underrated films as well. So yes, he's continually in dialogue. So some films are going to bring up some aspects of one film or another, and others, other aspects. And again, Irrational Man, in a sense, goes back to husband and wives again. We have a professor dealing with a young woman. It deals with all his morality films, from Match Point, from Crimes and Misdemeanors to Match Point at Cassandra's Dream, in dealing with guilt and the element of morality, existentialism, and so on. So that is an aspect of memory as well in his films.
Alex, your comment on memory in Woody Allen's canon?
I think you could sort of use memory and time almost together as a kind of comment on art. I think especially in that film, I've always taken the ending to be affecting for a number of reasons, both personal and also what's actually on the screen. And the personal side of it is, I have a very strong affinity for art, and I take the ending as as a comment on just these sorts of lives that they think they are on some level engaging in art. You have, for example, The Masked Avenger that is, I guess a small C creative in the sense that, he's on the radio, he's doing voices, there's these lines, they may be, cheesy and silly and bad and campy, but in his mind, he's doing something that is at the very least, small C creative. And yet while at the end, he also recognizes that he's probably not doing enough to be remembered. It takes somebody like Woody Allen, meaning a great artist, to be able to allow these things to live on. And it's interesting that we could have this now in cinema, we could have this now in the arts as a whole, and you couldn't have it many years ago, obviously. To Woody Allen, you said 1935, I think actually the time period must be the early either the very late 30s or the early 40s, because there's the German U-boats that they're trying to spot. So there's this, it's already World War II at the time. And he is, he's basically able to take this time period, which if it wasn't for Woody, because I don't know of many artworks that capture this time period this well. If it wasn't for Woody, it would have been one of those, decades that passes that, kids would go up and they'd be like, hey, do you remember, seeing this on the radio or experiencing that? And they would think about it, and these memories would sort of, flit in their minds, but after they would be gone, that's it, they would dissolve. But a great artist could actually take these moments and construct something real out of it. Now, when you want to know at least about the spirit, of the 30s and the 40s in New York, and the kinds of families that would get together, the kinds of things they would do, you would look at that film and you'd absolutely get it. Now, think of all the kinds of time periods that were completely lost because there were no artists, more or less fighting for them. Who knows what Rome might have been like in, 221 AD, or what a certain half decade at the ascent of Genghis Khan, what was that like for regular people? What was their mini decade like? Nobody was around to prop this up and turn it into something real, turn it into something that has long-term capital. But Woody Allen, very often he hones in on these little periods. He hones in on these whether it's like jokes or time periods or whatever it might be, just the spirit of an age, and he's able to very much look that up and have it be there forever. It's not simply a memory in his mind. And there might have been many people from his time period that thought like, hey, I wish this period was deeper somehow. I wish it was more memorable. And here Woody Allen comes along. He actually makes it so. It wasn't as deep, obviously, as this 90-minute narrative. you know, because things don't fall out in life in that way. But he's able to make it that way. And I think this is a great function of art, and I think in his films, time very much functions in this way.
Let me. Oh, go ahead, Ben.
Another element of memory in his film is music,
Yeah.
which I think has consistently been pre-50s, and I think Irrational Man breaks that rule. I don't know if it's the first one, but that, what is it, In the In Crowd theme is from the 60s. But other than that, and Radio Days, of course, is steeped in the late 30s and into the 40s. There's music from that period, and that's always a memory to him and for us of that golden age in music.
Yeah, I was thinking of the line from Another Woman: "Is a memory is something you have or something you've lost," that Jenna Rollins' character says. And I also was thinking of what is the one from the mid '90s? Oh, it just slipped my mind. But let's talk about some of these later recapitulations too, because you had mentioned, Vincent, anything else as a sort of recapitulation and sequel to Annie Hall. Certainly you get here. You also get sort of stand-ins for Woody with varying degrees of success. And you know, you had in Celebrity, you had Kenneth Branagh, you had Larry David in I forget the movie of a few years ago.
Whatever works.
Right. And so, what is your overall sense of this final period? Is Woody just sort of you know, sort of take from his older stuff? I mean, because to me, think of any work from this later period that could stand alongside, say, Stardust Memories or Crimes and Misdemeanors or Hannah and Her Sisters.
What period exactly? Are we talking about the 2000s or?
Yeah. Well, from say the early '90s on, say the last quarter century.
Okay, let me say that it's a very complex period. We can't simply talk about it as the post-scandal period. It is, on one level, it's the post-scandal period, but it has various phases to it. I think you go up to Deconstructing Harry, and that was looked at critically and at the box office as somewhat of a breakthrough, as a return to form, if you will. It was a recapitulation, as we talked about. But then we get clearly into the post-New York phase. I mean, that's a critical break in his work. To leave New York, it was foreshadowed in Hollywood Ending, where he goes off to France because his film bombed in America and is regarded as a great masterpiece in France. And what would happen then with Midnight in Paris, right? Is that what it's called? Midnight in Paris?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
In which his breakthrough then occurs both critically and in box office in Paris. Anyway, so there's the post-New York phase, even though whatever works comes back to New York briefly, and now he's going to be coming back to New York in the next film a little bit. Well, we have the post-New York phase, which then also, arguably, as I argued earlier, he succeeds in making serious films that are successful in their own right, and they're not looked at as completely derivative of Bergman or somebody else, taking place in Europe. Interestingly, he had to get away from New York, get away from his persona, which he does increasingly from anything else on, where he may appear in his films, but he's no longer the protagonist in the film. He's not the protagonist in anything else. He's not the protagonist in Scoop. He's not the protagonist in To Rome with Love. Okay, the ones that he does appear in, he's no longer the protagonist. So he's moved himself to the margins, if at all, and then he's able to make successful, serious films from the post-New York period on. So, I mean, there are definite phases that occur. I think he's in a new phase now because he's not bound to being in Europe. He's made a film in San Francisco. He went back to Europe for one, the Magic in the Moonlight, and now he's back to the States. So anyway, there are various phases. I don't think we can just lump together, But I would argue that the scandal continues to play a role in conscious and unconscious ways in his various films. I can come back to that at a later time.
Peter, any comment from you?
There's so many films, and to answer simply, Midnight in Paris seems to me to be up there with the very best of his films. I think he's thoroughly in control of what he's doing there. The kind of irony that Alex was talking that's present is very much present in the treatment of Gil Pender, and that's very, very effectively done. I know Inez and her family are one-dimensional characters, but it is a comedy, and to me, that's a very, very effective comedy. I actually like Vicky Cristina Barcelona more than a lot of people do. I think that's I understand what it does to Barcelona that some critics have been very critical of, and I agree, but it's still a movie that for me has a great deal of momentum, a great deal of humor, and a great deal of insight into what we want and why we don't get it very often. And he's very good at that. So yeah, I would agree that there's some bad ones in that lot, but for me there's some very good ones too, including Blue Jasmine. It's a one character movie, but it's not just Streetcar Named Desire all over again. I think it's much more than that.
Yeah, I that's the last Woody Allen film I saw. I did not think it was a particularly good film. I thought it didn't know whether it wanted to be a comedy or a drama. The film in that period, though, that I think that is really underrated, and I think has a really emotionally devastating ending, is Sweet and Lowdown. And
Yes,
I think Samantha Morton.
absolutely.
I think Samantha Morton gives maybe the best wordless performance since the silent era. And I think the breakdown of Sean Penn there, because he's such an over-the-top, and he's an over-the-top character that isn't really a Woody stand-in, but he's such an over-the-top character. And then at the end, when he breaks his own guitar, I mean, it's one of, I think, one of the moments, but it's also possibly, we don't know what goes on after the film, but it's something that could possibly release the character. And I've never really heard it discussed. If any of you want to just comment on that film, because I've never really heard it discussed by anyone as anything more than just a throwaway Woody.
Yeah, I go into the film in depth in my book. So in the book, I separate the post-Golden Age period into two periods. So one is from 93 till 2004. I consider that much more of an experimental period that has, it has a lot more value than I thought it would. I came into this time period thinking like, let me just get through these films. It's probably going to be, pretty bad. It's going to be annoying to watch. But I was very shocked that most of them were, anywhere between, very good to, almost great films. And then afterwards, from 2005 up until the present period. But anyway, Sweet and Lowdown, it's probably, maybe in his top 5 or 6 best acted films that he's ever made. Both Samantha Morton and Sean Penn do really, really good jobs. I mean, it's very well written. You despite the fact that it's primarily a comedy, you notice like so many little things, and this is the difference between a really good comedy versus some of the more gag-driven stuff he did earlier. You notice so many little quirks of personality that correspond to just real life breathing human beings. You see, for instance, when Samantha Morton is forced to change Sean Penn's character's car tire, and he's kind of just lounging out, and she's kind of doing this on her own, and she's sort of putting it on, and there's this music playing in the background because he's on the guitar, and after she finally puts it on, she just kind of spins it one time, and she just kind of looks at it so lovingly, that this is something that belongs to her boyfriend, and she's enjoying this moment despite the fact that she's objectively being mistreated. Part of her doesn't mind all that much. And this is exactly what you see in real human relationships. This is not simply, a comedy. Despite the fact that there's so many things to laugh about, these people are very, very real, no matter how over the top they are. And this is the difference between, suspension of disbelief in the sense of facts, you could have a suspension of belief when you read a fantasy book, or when you read or when you watch a science fiction film, and that's very much forgivable. But the one thing that is not forgivable is you cannot have a suspension of disbelief when it comes to character. Now, Peter has praised Midnight in Paris. In my book, I actually go into depth exactly why I think the film fails in many regards, despite the fact that I actually enjoy quite a bit. I think it fails on many levels. In that film, you have a suspension of disbelief when it comes to the characters, because they're so one-dimensional, and they do things that are not simply one-dimensional, but they do things that are not even recognizably human. When you have, for instance, Gil Bender, when he has these earrings that he wants to give to his lover back in the 1920s, and he misplaces them, and his fiance is going crazy, like, where are my earrings? Where's this? Where's that? And he's acting in a way that is so over the top suspicious, so ridiculously, like, if you see a person acting like this in real life, all your attention will focus on him, and you're going to ask, why the fuck are you doing this? But instead, everybody ignores it. Everybody ignores the most obvious thing that's going on simply to move the plot along. And you have so many of these suspension of disbelief when it comes to characters, just unforgivable. That does not happen to Sweet and Low Down, despite the fact that you have an over-the-top character with Sean Penn. You have his eyebrows basically permanently sticking up like this. Yes, this is like a bit unbelievable. People don't do that, but that's fairly superficial. The things that people actually do are the things that he ends up doing, on a deeper level. The way that he interacts with others, the way that he destroys himself, the way, as Dan mentioned, that he destroys the guitar, and he sort of goes into this rage that completely probably makes him peter out. Maybe he ends up having a more healthy life, but he is no longer really an artist after that point. The film is just full of these kinds of moments, and you have to get over some of the over-the-top things, because yes, they're there for the comedic value, but these are also real human beings, and many comedies lack that. They do not have the real human being quality. They simply have the gags, and they have everything else, but if you include this part of it, that really takes a comedy to a whole other level. It's no longer just a comedy. You can't simply think of it in those terms anymore.
Any final comments on this? Because in the next segment, I want to talk about Alan and the critical relations, and also about some other era. So, any final comments on the
Sweet and Low Down? I bring up the notion of the separation between the artist and the man, which I think is a key theme in that film, which we used earlier, and the front brought up for the first time the notion of I confused the artist and the man. I just want you to know I still respect the artist, which again would haunt Woody Allen from The Scandal on.
Okay, so let's end this segment, and when we get back in our final segment, we'll have closing remarks. But I also want to talk a little bit about, as I said, critics and a couple of other American Jewish filmmakers and their relationship or not to Woody Allen. We'll do that in a moment. Well, I want to end this interview in this segment before we get to any closing remarks. I wanted to talk a little bit first about Woody Allen and the critics, and then some relations to other filmmakers of Jewish persuasion. So let's talk just shortly about Allen versus the critics, and let's just talk about the whole overall arc. Has Allen consistently been misrepresented, do you think, by critics as a whole? Do you think that they've been more or less on the ball? Have they generally come around? For example, most Stanley Kubrick films opened to terrible reviews. Even his last one, Eyes Wide Shut, which I thought was a masterpiece when I saw it. Now, 15 years later or so, people are finally coming around to that film. What has been the Allen relationship to critics? So let me start off with Vincent Brooke.
Okay, well, when in his earlier period, he was regarded as an up-and-coming comic. And then with Annie Hall, the consensus was, and continues, as we've, this breakthrough to a higher level as a filmmaker and then we had that crisis of the comic versus the serious films that there was pretty big consensus about, that he should stick to making comedies, which he then deals with and started as Memories very openly, and then continues to grapple with by going back and forth. Until we get to The Scandal, that brought in a new era of criticism regarding the artist and the man element. And then when we get to Deconstructing Harry, there seemed to be somewhat of a consensus that this was a breakthrough film, a return to form. I think Kenneth Turan called it in the LA Times. But, as Alex pointed out, if we reevaluate some of those films, and I went through a similar process to you, Alex, in writing the book on Woody Allen. I had to go back, and I dreaded having to go back to this period where I had not seen many of those films because the critics said no good, or they said, oh, finally a comeback. And I would go to see the film and I would say, not yet. But then when I went back to see the films, maybe 10, 20 years later, I found, again, many worthwhile films during that period. That's the question about evaluation. It's a subjective phenomenon. Anyway, so then we have, I think, a consensus that when he went to Europe and with Match Point and Cassandra's Dream, there was a comeback, a serious raising the bar again on his work, with some ups and downs here and there. Midnight in Paris, again, a consensus that was a step up. I'm sort of in between Alex and Peter on that in terms of it being so good and maybe not quite as good as some people said. But that's me. Then the consensus, now, he's sort of drifted away. Jasmine, again, was regarded as a step up. And after the last couple of films have not been taken seriously again. Magic and Moonlight, I think, is pretty much a throwaway. It's beautiful to look at, and the performances are wonderful, but there's not much there. Rational Man, we can maybe get to that later. So yeah, there's been this up and down with them, but again, open to a reevaluation that my book attempted to achieve, and others, perhaps Peter, when you bring your book up to date, you'll do some reevaluating there as well. So, okay, that's my summary.
Okay. Peter, what is your take on Allen versus the critics?
Well, I should have mentioned at the beginning that I also edited a book called Companion to Woody Allen with Sam B. Gurgis, who also has a book on Woody Allen. And that had 26 critics, all of whom, with maybe a couple of exceptions, were quite positive about Allen, about the likelihood of his films continuing to be seen, to be valued after he's gone. The real question, of course, is how do you deal, we're having this exact problem this morning, how do you deal with a guy who's got 50 films? How do you make sense of that without just saying, okay, here's 5 that are good and 5 that aren't? Yeah, I mean, he's created that problem that I think, in a way, is a wonderful problem to have, but it does create, as Vincent points out, there are some films that maybe, I'm not sure any of the 4 of us would look forward to seeing Magic and the Moonlight again. I've seen it 4 or 5 times, and I got to the point that I could actually think, well, maybe it's better than I thought. But, they're just those films that he's doing one a year, and he insists on doing one a year. And some people might say, why not every 2 years? Maybe he wouldn't have made Small-Time Crooks if you didn't have to make one a year. That's what we've got. That's what we're dealing with. I think people in the future are going to have a lot of trouble figuring out what to make of Woody Allen with his 50, we hope 55 films, some of which are wonderful and some of which aren't, but they're all reflective of the man who made them.
Alex, your comments on Allen and the critics?
Well, a couple things. First, desire to make a film a year. To be fair, I don't think at this point, if he were to do fewer films, that it would translate to necessarily higher quality. Because if you think back, Annie Hall and Interiors were separated by 1 year. I'd consider both films to be, at the very least, excellent films. Then there was Manhattan, another great film. Then you had Source Memories, another great film. And then you had Entire Decade, which was great film after great film for the most part. And he hasn't had really anything of too much value in my mind, for almost a decade now. His last, really good work was Cassandra's Dream. That was now 8 years ago. I don't think, I don't think he approaches film in the sense that, you know, if I give myself 2 years, I will be able to really polish this thing and, you know, make it better. He just does it because it's simply how it works, and he's always done it. He's done it from the very beginning. It has never impacted his quality, it doesn't seem. And it's certainly not going to impact his quality now. I think he's very much lost it. I don't think it's going to make much of a difference. Back to criticism at large, you know, I don't put too much stock in any kind of critical consensus, because when you think of the word consensus, you know, this applies to a scientific consensus, which, if you look back in history, you know, a scientific consensus is usually little more than a political consensus. You could have, you know, an artistic consensus, which, if you look at, you know, the popular writers of like 1925, or, you know, the painters that sold for the most money in, you know, 1847, they're people that we have no idea who they are now. And then you have the other kind of consensus, which translates to everything, which is a mob. A mob is also a kind of consensus. So to put much value in, you know, some kind of mass opinion, you know, it's very silly. And when I first started watching Woody films, I didn't have this baggage of any kind of consensus. I didn't read the critics. I didn't read what people said about Another Woman. I didn't read what people said about Star Wars Memories. I didn't read what people said about Deconstructing Harry. I simply went with the films first, and then I went on to do the reading, and I was very often shocked by what I read. I think probably one of the biggest problems in criticism when it comes to Woody Allen has been Pauline Kael. I think Pauline Kael is both a terrible writer and also a very bad judge of anything artistic. And I say this for a number of reasons. In my book, I actually go through every single film that she's ever critiqued in The New Yorker, and I think maybe in some other places as well, of Woody Allen. And I go, sometimes, I go literally paragraph by paragraph, you know, deconstructing her claims, saying, in this scene she says X, Y, and Z, but actually, in this next paragraph, she contradicts her own statement here. She makes this judgment here, is contradicted by another statement there. So she couldn't even keep herself consistent from paragraph to paragraph in her own writing, much less use the evidence on screen. And I have a few examples of this. One famous one is her comment about Manhattan, where she says something like, you know, only Woody Allen could pass off a predilection for 17-year-olds as a quest for true values. And this quote has been very much used and reused as kind of like, wow, you know, like what a killer line against Woody Allen, what a killer line against Manhattan. That really puts the nail in the coffin of that film. But if you in fact have any idea what the film is, there's no way that you could take one of the film's illusions and consider it as one of its quests or one of its reasons. Woody Allen is so critical, Woody Allen being the director and the writer, is so critical of the characters within Manhattan, much more so than he is of Alvy and Annie Hall. You have, you know, Isaac, who's manipulated, and also he's kind of like a wannabe murderer. At one point, he always jokes about like running over his ex-wife's girlfriend, but in fact, at one point, he admits to wanting to do that, and he does it in a moment of lust when he's first getting to know Mary. So he's this would-be murderer. He's this, you know, he's this guy that's both insecure and, you know, he's like ripping relationships apart. He's using this 17-year-old girl for his own ends. This is not a quest for true values. The whole film is predicated upon all these illusions that Woody Allen is very slowly attacking. And he's attacking it in a way that most people won't notice because they see the lush imagery. They see the music playing. They see that, oh my God, you know, the very last scene, he's now with Tracy. She might take him back. But they seem to miss the fact that he's manipulated her up until this point. He's demanding that she drops her bags and drops her plans for the summer to go with this, you know, balding 40-something-year-old guy who she's never really going to want to be with down the line because she's too smart, she's too mature to, you know, not see through his manipulations in the long run. And yet, Pauline Kael does so many obvious things and, you know, passes judgment on the film with that one line that no matter how people quote it, it's just 100% wrong. It's factually wrong, and everything about it is just completely contrary to what the film is. Again, the book is, I go through like a dozen reviews that she did. It's the same problems nonstop. Jonathan Rosenbaum is another famous critic who kind of dismisses pretty much all his films. He did this long essay, he calls it Towards a Devaluation of Woody Allen. He argues that Jerry Lewis is a superior artist to Woody, and The problem with Rosenbaum though is that even when he makes claims, Pauline Kael, she provides evidence. It's the wrong evidence. It's evidence that contradicts her own claims. But Rosenbaum does not even condescend to even provide any evidence. He makes these statements by fiat. He says this is what it is, and then he moves on. He hopes that nobody will challenge these positions because he doesn't even really have a coherent argument. Because an argument, in and of itself, it requires evidence. You cannot do that without argumentation. It's not something that's feasible in film criticism. Criticism is predicated upon some kind of argument. Same thing with Stardust Memories. When it came out, I'm not sure if it was people being influenced by Pauline Kael, if it was something else, or if people were being influenced by Ebert, who also complained about the so-called bitching in the film. But audiences and critics alike, they sort of saw it as this is an attack upon us. This is an attack upon the film world in general, and they missed everything else that I talked about earlier in my little rant about Stardust Memories. Then, I have not seen a very good criticism of Woody. Even when there are judgments that I agree with, I still find them to be problematic because I don't simply want to agree with somebody. That's very boring. You don't need to. You can't simply come to a correct conclusion. You have to have a consistent and intelligent way of reaching this conclusion. You can't tell me that Manhattan is a great film and say it's a great film because look at these cliches or look at these illusions. Isn't that so wonderful? That's not the evidence they should use to make an argument for greatness. So even when people very often have made correct judgments about the films, meaning like this is a great film, Interior is a great film, or Manhattan is a great film, they use the wrong evidence. And to me, it's not just a quibble. This is a serious problem because if you don't know how to properly use evidence in making judgments, it means that even if your judgment is correct in this instance, when you get another great film put in front of you, because you have no way of using evidence, you might miss that film as great because you simply don't know how to go about doing this. So to me, it's a real issue that Woody Allen has both been misinterpreted in terms of the evaluations have been incorrect very often, and often when the evals are correct, they're correct for the wrong reasons. The reason behind them is faulty. In the long run, this is damaging to art. We have to have the two align. You need to have correct judgments on the one hand, that's great, but the more important thing is you need to have the correct reasoning. You need to have correct reasoning that leads to the judgment. It should go both ways. If you don't have both elements of this formula, you're going to lead yourself into a dead end, and it's no better than anything else. You need to find a way out, and I think Woody is finding a way out after decades have passed.
Well, let me end the interview. I wanted to talk about Woody Allen, since Vincent has written a lot on the Jewishness, and the two American filmmakers, and you would sort of prefigure this by mentioning Jerry Lewis, that Allen is often lumped in with pro or con. Jerry Lewis, who's regarded as a hero and a great artist in France, and also Mel Brooks, who was also mentioned earlier. Now, in the break, the other Vincent, Peter had mentioned a couple of other filmmakers, but let me start with Woody Allen vis-a-vis Lewis and Brooks. And it seems to me that I think it had been Vince earlier who had mentioned that Allen seemed to move beyond this gag-driven comedy, whereas neither Allen nor Lewis really did. So let's start with both.
You mean neither Brooks nor
Brooks? Yeah, Brooks or Lewis never did. So if either Peter or Vincent want to talk about the comparison to those two, and then we can talk about some other Jewish filmmakers.
Vincent, this is your home territory.
Necessarily.
Home field advantage.
Okay, the Jewish aspect certainly I can deal with. Jerry Lewis was not a very Jewish filmmaker or comic, really. He changed his name. I don't look at him as a Jewish. I mean, he was Jewish, yes, but the Jewishness does not come to the fore. So I really don't compare the two at all. And I mean, he was a goofball character also that doesn't relate to Woody Allen's more mature Schlemiel, if you will, as he developed it. So I don't put those two together. Mel Brooks, obviously, they started out with Sid Caesar. They started out as gag writers. They started out making parodies, and I would say Mel Brooks's earliest parodies were among his greatest. Lady in the Saddles, which had a satirical element to it, which was very strong that I think faded with his later work that just seemed to be sheer parody. Well, there was some satire, I guess, in the Star Wars one. Well, but yeah, he stuck pretty much to the parody vein, and there's nothing to paraphrase Seinfeld. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but Woody Allen obviously rose above that and developed further as an artist. I wanted to bring in Sidney Lumet because I think there's an interesting contrast between the two. Sidney Lumet, a serious filmmaker. I don't know if he made any comedies. Oh no, he did actually. Bye Bye Braverman, I think was a comedy.
Which is a pretty good comedy, actually.
Yeah, based on a novel. But he's a serious filmmaker and a very openly, overtly, admittedly, determinedly political filmmaker. One of the most political filmmakers in American film. And I've written an article about that and focusing on the political aspect. Woody Allen is not an overtly political filmmaker, but there are political elements that come into play, and that's interesting. When I brought up The Front, I saw that as a learning experience for him cinematically, but he did not go into that vein politically. There are political elements to his films, both pro and con. It's been a nagging I'm a very political, engaged person, so I tend to look at the world in that vein. And I don't dismiss Woody Allen because he's not an overtly political filmmaker, but there is a lack, certainly, of dealing with race, sexual orientation. Class, however, he has begun to deal with a little more. We can go back, actually, to, what was the film we dealt with? Radio Days has a definite class element. It's really constructed through a cross-cutting between Woody Allen's family, which is portrayed as very much a working-class Jewish family, and cutting to these radio personalities who live these lavish, 1%, if you will, style lives. And even early on, the narrator says they're in two different worlds. Now, again, it's not overtly critical, that discrepancy, but it's there. It's definitely there. And arguably, in some of his European films, the class element comes at Match Point. Is definitely a class critique of some sort. So is Cassandra's Dream. And I think there's another film that deals with it. But he absolutely, almost completely ignores race, except in music and in sports. His heroes are Willie Mays and Louis Armstrong, and that's supposed to tell us, oh, I'm not a racist. I love black people, but we don't see any other black people in New York, for Christ's sake. Why are they not there? I mean, that is a nagging critique I have of Woody Allen. I think Chiwetel Ejiofor in Melinda and Melinda is about the only somewhat major black character who's presented in a three-dimensional way. Okay. Again, this does not mean I don't like Woody Allen, but I think that is a nagging critique you can make from certainly an ideological perspective in his work. As far as gays go, he has some sympathetic gay character that I can recall in Whatever Works, towards the end of that film. There's a sympathetic character, a gay character, who plays a somewhat significant role. I think that's an element that should be brought up. And again, critics have brought that up. Again, that's not all you can say or should say about Woody Allen, but I think it's something that you can bring up and that has significance.
Peter, any comments about Mel Brooks, Jerry Lewis, or any other Jewish filmmakers?
Mel Brooks, as Vincent said, Mel Brooks just went in a completely different direction, and they're just so different given their choices that I don't see that they're at all comparable, except, as you say, they both wrote jokes for Sid Caesar. So then they started diverging and very different careers. Jerry Lewis, I haven't seen those movies in so long, I would hesitate to say a word about Jerry Lewis movies. So.
You had mentioned Barry Levinson, I believe, but
I think Barry Levinson is the one filmmaker you can say is constantly watching Alan films and learning from them, even though he is more specifically concerned with issues of Jewishness in my perception. But still, he's one of the few filmmakers I think we can say he's watched Alan and he's learned from it.
I've got somebody to bring up that I think is significant. That's Judd Apatow.
Okay. Yeah.
Judd Apatow and the so-called Jew-Tang clan. His comics, Seth Rogen, Jonah Hill, et al. And he's a very overtly Jewish filmmaker. His greatest film, in my estimation, it's flawed and it was panned and didn't do well, is Funny People, which deals with Jewish comics.
Yes, right.
Yeah. With Adam Sandler as well and Seth Rogen. Very Jewish and very Woody Allen-ish in some ways.
Yeah.
Trying to bring in the serious element. He's also seemingly failed at trying to make more serious films. That was a very serious film about funny people and comedy, and he seems to be going back, in the comic direction since then with Trainwreck. But yes, he's very overtly Jewish in many of his films, and I wouldn't put him on a level with him or approaching him, but somebody to take seriously. That could be compared with Woody Allen, and I'm sure Woody Allen is an idol of his.
Alex, do you have any comments regarding Alan and any other Jewish American filmmakers?
I always found it odd to have Alan kind of lumped into the category of Jerry Lewis, Mel Brooks, and a couple others. Primarily because, as good as, for example, Jerry Lewis is what he does or did, he was more or less an entertainer. And Woody Allen is also an entertainer to a degree, but he's done much more than merely entertain. Some of his best films, I don't necessarily find very entertaining. I don't find Interiors to be very entertaining. If I could get out of watching that film, I would. But it's a great film nonetheless, and it's important to watch it. It's important to be able to grow from these things that do more than simply entertain. I think the biggest influence that Woody has had on other filmmakers is probably those that, there's bigger ones, there's small ones, there's films, for example, like a film from I believe it's the early 90s called Metropolitan. There's those that are trying to do these kinds of romantic comedies with a kind of like fairly serious undertone. All of that kind of stems from Annie Hall. It stems from Manhattan. I think the problem, though, with a lot of the newer filmmakers who are trying to, I wouldn't necessarily say ape Woody Allen, they're trying to do similar things, but I think the main issue is they see a film like Annie Hall, they see a film like Manhattan, and they sort of take it at face value. And they think, it's a fairly simple thing to be recreated. Most filmmakers or film goers, for that matter, they would look at a film like Manhattan, and they would more or less see, the surface area. They would see, like, hey, it's beginning, with these cliches delivered by Isaac, who's trying to capture, the feel of the city. It's this, beautiful, lush imagery. It's, it's this kind of music. It's these kinds of romantic situations. But if you only see that and you don't necessarily see the way that everything there is being so skewered, you're just going to recreate the illusion. And I think, so many of the romantic comedies that I've seen with these, serious underpinnings, they do a good job of recreating the illusion, but that means they do a good job of recreating the surface. And that's a big problem if you're talking about real cinema. I don't think that much real cinema has stemmed from Woody Allen just yet. That might change later on, especially when, some of the illusions that his films do have will be seen for what they are, as opposed to, being the end all of the films themselves. So I think in a decade or two, you're probably going to see a lot more of the deeper influence that he very much deserves to have upon culture.
All right, well, let's end this interview, and I'll give each of you any final or closing remarks. We'll start with Alex, if you want to go first.
So far, a lot of what I heard in the interview, people talk about their likes and dislikes, they talk about their favorite films, and, this on some level is important. We are drawn to things that we personally either identify with or that move us to some degree, but it's important to make some distinctions. It's important to see a difference between things that you might be personally moved by versus things that ought to move you, or things that you need to give space and need to give an opportunity to move you or to affect you in some other manner. I mentioned a film like In Tears, again, not my favorite Woody film, but it is important to grow from. A fan favorite. Up until Midnight in Paris, his most popular film was Hannah and Her Sisters. That's one of my least favorite films of his to watch, despite the fact that most people would find it one of his most enjoyable. There's no rhyme and reason for this. There's nothing I could really point to say this is why I feel about it in this way. And yet I still consider it a truly great film, and I write about it extensively. I give it the attention that it deserves, despite my personal feelings. And it's very important to be able to look at your own personal feelings in any kind of matter. Whether it's art or whether it's the things that could be, if not felt, then at least thought about and put together. Someone on a higher plane. And I think people when they approach cinema, they should keep this in mind. Cinema is just like any art form, just like any form of reading, or any way that you might challenge yourself. Cinema is another way of challenging yourself. It's another way of opening yourself up to something that's going to make you grow in directions that you don't necessarily expect. I did not expect to ever be a film fan when I was 20, but by 27, I had a film book. That's very different. And yet, if I closed myself off, these things would not be possible. So just keep an open mind and do it in a way that's intelligent.
Vincent Brooke, closing remarks from you.
Okay, a couple of things just in terms of what Alex said. It's ironic, I think, about people aping Woody Allen when he was accused of aping other people throughout his career. I just want to, there's a cute anecdote, I think, that ties in some way, certainly to the scandal aspect of Woody Allen. After my last book on Woody Allen in 2014, and I was asked to deliver a presentation on it to a Jewish group at Cal State Long Beach, and it was right after the Dylan scandal, where she revived the accusations of pedophilia against her when she was 7, and created quite a stir. And right after that, I thought it was bad timing. Now I'm going to have to go before these people and talk about Woody Allen, and they're going to throw stones at me for this. So I was prepared, however, to defend him, because I think the evidence is quite strong that he was very likely not engaged with pedophilia with Dylan. I mean, that's my opinion. If you look at the evidence, of course he's denied it. But I came prepared to defend him. So I gave my presentation at the Q&A. I'm ready to defend him. And to a man and a woman in this Jewish crowd, they were totally behind Woody Allen. They were criticizing Mia Farrow. She's the guilty party in this affair. So I thought that was just an interesting comment. It was if, he's one of ours. And, Little Women, Jay Simpson, if you will, sitting up there. We're going to stand behind Woody Allen 100%. That's the way I interpret that to a certain degree. So I think that's interesting. Also, going back to what Peter said, what are we going to do about Woody Allen with 50 films? What are we doing with Alfred Hitchcock with close to 50 films? We've had a similar situation with him, and in some ways, I think there's some interesting parallels. Besides which, Woody Allen has remade some, or certainly been influenced by Hitchcock in some of his films very openly. The murder mysteries, any murder mystery is related to Hitchcock, including the last one, Irrational Man. But there are phases in Hitchcock's work as well. His British phase, certainly, and his American phase, regarded as his golden age in the 50s. And you can evaluate them, certainly. People do. Vertigo, Rear Window, and Psycho, and others as regarded as his greatest. But is that the most interesting thing to do, or to evaluate his work as a whole? What does it say about the human condition? What does it say about cinema? What does it say about Hitchcock? And again, his personal life figures into his work in interesting ways as well. So, we can't sum up Woody Allen in one word, but there's my 2 cents.
Okay, before I go to Pete, you brought up a point, Vincent, mystery. I don't know if any of how aware of you guys are of a thing called mashups online, but I was thinking when you mentioned the murder mystery, I thought of the ending of a Manhattan Murder Mystery, where the lady from Shanghai cracked glass ending is playing, and we see a real murder being committed, and it's interesting because Alex had mentioned what's going to come from Woody Allen. That was made, I think, in 93, 94 maybe, Manhattan Murder Mystery, from an earlier script, but yet that 4 or 5 minute segment where Lady from Shanghai is playing and we see a real murder happen is something that really prefigures a lot of what's being the meta kind of notion that a lot of internet filmmakers are using. But anyway, I just wanted to throw that in. But Peter, any final comments from you?
I don't know if I want to say this, but maybe I will. I do kind of wish that if I could change anything about Woody Allen, it might be his negative attitude towards criticism. And I understand part of it. I understand that people have said, as Alex has pointed out, many stupid things about his work. Sometimes that if you remember the Eric Lax interview where he talks about, it's hard to tell if he's talking about Match Point or Crimes and Misdemeanors, but he's insisting that what he said in that movie was absolutely clear.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a sign of the fact that this is a self-educated man who doesn't want to pay attention to what other people say because he believes that his films are completely clear. I don't think the four of us would agree that his films are completely clear because we don't believe that artists work in such a way to be completely clear about something as complicated as guilt and innocence and what those two films are certainly about. So the one small criticism I might make is that maybe there would have been even better movies than there already are had he had more people around to say, Woody, cut that scene, Woody, this isn't working. But maybe that's the only criticism I have. I think Alex commented very aptly to my comment about one film a year. In the end, I'm very happy he's made one film a year. 50 wonderful films, and not all of them are wonderful, and that's fine too.
Yeah. I just wanted to a couple of points. You reminded me of the end of the documentary on Woody Allen 3 or 4 years ago. My wife was always commenting because I think the very final scene, he says, "Somehow I feel I got screwed." And here's a guy who's a multimillionaire, who's been able to do any film that he wants, has had the financial and artistic freedom, only maybe rivaled by Kubrick, and yet he does it. So there's always the sense that he knows that he's had a good life. You can't really buy this stuff when I think he says that he thinks this film of his was bad, or that I don't believe that he really thinks that he's so far below Bergman. Maybe he does believe Bergman is the greater filmmaker, but I don't think he thinks he's a bad filmmaker. And the other thing, the Manhattan Murder Mystery, it did strike me too that reference to Lady from Shanghai. I think even though that film isn't in a league, I don't think, with Stardust Memories, it is, I think, one of his best 4 or 5 minute segments, if taken as a standalone, just as a sort of bravura cinematic moment. But I thank all three of the Woody Allen film experts for this show. Tomorrow, keeping with the filmic theme, I'll have 3 experts on Michelangelo Antonioni, and we'll be doing a very similar thing. So again, thanks to Alex, Vincent, and Peter. Their websites or links to their works will be below this video. And again, thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.